Hello, Maddie.
Hi, friend. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Living the dream.
Oh, awesome. I am also living the dream. Hello, everybody. This is Sarah Rugenstone, in case you weren't aware. Maddie, why do we find ourselves here today?
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for asking. We are in a sermon series right now called Dynamic Duo, and all of our site pastors are taking a famous duo from scripture and we're writing a sermon about it. And so we decided to sit down. Yeah, I don't know if you know that, but you do have a message coming up, so you better get to writing. But we're sitting down and having conversations about the stuff in the message that just don't make it in on Sunday morning. And so we're going into like the layers of the conversation, and I'm really excited about it.
I love it. Thank you so much for explaining. So to kick it off then, week one, who is your duo and what is their story?
Oh my gosh. I have one of my favorite duos, actually. So I am talking about Ruth and Naomi, which we find in the book of Ruth in the Old Testament.
Hey, imagine that.
I know. They get a whole book. It is a very easy read. It's like 4 chapters long, so you can crank it out in a day.
Boom.
And it actually, fun fact, is like ratio-wise, like it has like the highest ratio of dialogue of any book in scripture.
Okay.
So it is the most story-like it'll read like a book. Yeah. Which is really wonderful. And the story I think is really interesting. So the whole thing is bookended around the experience of an elderly widow named Naomi. And it starts with a great loss in her life and ends with kind of this like great rebirth and resolution, which I think is really cool. But in the actual story, it kicks off with this man named Elimelech, who is married to Naomi. That name is a mouthful, and I practiced it to make sure I got it right.
It's impressive. Elimelech. Say that 5 times. I won't say it 5. I can't even say 5 times fast. Oh my gosh.
I know. It's hard. Elimelech. He is doing his best. They have 2 sons, and they end up fleeing Israel and moving to the land of Moab because there is a famine that is unfolding. So they move in the attempt to, protect themselves and survive the famine. Once they're there, their sons get married to women named Ruth and Orpah. And then in about 10 years of being there, Elimelech and both their sons pass. And so you have 3 now widows.
Elimelech eliminated.
Dun, dun. I feel like I need one of those buzzers, like wah, wah, wah. Elimelech was eliminated alongside the sons, leaving
those guys too.
the 3 women by themselves. So Naomi eventually hears that the famine has ended in Israel. She decides she's going to return back, but she recognizes how difficult that process would actually be for Orpah and Ruth for a variety of reasons. And so she encourages them to return to their families. They have this like very emotional conversation full of grief. Orpah eventually decides to return back to her family, but Ruth very adamantly clings to Naomi and says like, I'm not going anywhere. And that's where we get this passage that often comes up in weddings of where you go, I will go, where you stay, I will stay. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. And it's a longer passage too. Yeah. But it's like this really profound moment, which I can talk about why it's profound in a little bit.
Yeah.
But so eventually Naomi's kind of goes into that. And so they return to Israel together at the beginning of the barley harvest. And in an attempt to keep them afloat, Ruth begins gleaning barley from a field of a guy named Boaz, who ends up being a distant relative of Elimelech, which plays into some laws at the time around the protection of widows and marrying the next like closest relative in order to preserve the family line. And so she's working in the field, kind of like, gleaning, which at the time was a way to care for the marginalized. So as you were harvesting things that would fall, they could go through and pick up off the ground. They would leave the outer edges alone for people to come through. So it was a way of providing for the community. And he went above and beyond in that when he learns of who she is and protects her from the men in the field, make sure that she's got water, make sure she's going home with enough food. Like he's really committed to making sure she's okay.
Boaz.
Which we love.
We do.
We love so much. And so as this goes on, Naomi realizes like, whoa, that's a relative. We got to wife you up, girl. And also he's wonderful and taking care of you. So let's like get on it, get a ring on your finger. So she eventually convinces Ruth to go get all dressed up to encounter Boaz on the threshing room floor, which is a whole other conversation that we can get into later. And eventually the conversation around them getting married happens. Boaz is very intrigued, but names that there's someone who actually might be further in line than him.
Ooh, scandalous.
I know. So he goes and kind of hashes everything out, ends up securing not just her as his wife, but also all of the land that Naomi would inherit will stay within the family through him.
Look at that.
And they get married. Eventually they have a child named Obed, and Obed goes on to be the great-grandfather of King David.
What? We love a good lineage.
I know. So in 4 chapters, stuff goes down.
A lot of stuff happened.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff happened. Dang. Okay. Well, what stuck out to you about these two as you have been writing your sermon?
How much time do we have?
We have.
I guess
as much time as you need. You're in charge here.
I'm getting to drive the ship, so as much time as I want. So many things stick out to me with this. I think one of the things I appreciate just in general about the book of Ruth is that it falls into this category of historical fiction in scripture with a woman as the protagonist, which I just really appreciate in general. Anytime you get a woman that is like the lead of the story. But the book itself, like the purpose of it is relatively unclear, but we do know that it is intended to convey some truths about a window of time. So it gives an interesting perspective around what it looked like to live rurally in ancient Israel, what it looks like to see two women with these really deep bonds kind of manipulate the systems that they're a part of for their mutual advantage. I think that like that is just always exciting to read about and then to interpret in our own experiences. The actual purpose of the book I find to be really interesting because we don't totally know what it is. So there's 2 kind of bigger theories. One is that the book itself was intended not necessarily to convey a ton of fact, but to convey a truth about King David, and to address his Moabite ancestry. So there's like some intentionality to like connect him and Ruth together. The fact that he has ancestry from Moab conflicts with laws we find in Deuteronomy. I think it's like chapter 23. I know. Saying that like no Moabite could be admitted into the assembly of the Lord, right? So by naming Ruth as like the model Moab woman, and making Naomi the surrogate mother for his ancestor, which then brings some like connection back to the Israelite community and his upbringing, you kind of mitigate some of that controversy by telling that story.
We love mitigated controversy.
Mm-hmm. It is so interesting.
It is very interesting. This story has layers.
Oh yeah.
A lot of layers.
Many layers. So that's one possibility, which could continue to be true regardless of the other potential reasons for it being written. But that one I think is really interesting. And also important to point out too is partially like we think about it like it's a historical fiction type of writing that it changes how we read it when we think about it in that way. But it also points back to a lot of things we see in scripture, which is this idea of like the balance between fact and truth. And is there a core message we're intended to take away from this? Or is this like a hard line fact? And that's a tension we have to toe all the time, you know, but
sure is.
Part of what is also interesting is that people think that Ruth was written in commentary to other books in the Bible. So there are a couple of books like Ezra and Nehemiah that go hand in hand that were written post Persian exile for the Israelite people. And, you know, when that happened, you see a lot of, you know, theological upheaval when it comes to this community. You have a community who believes that their land and their God is directly linked to geographically the space that they hold, the temple that they've built. And then they were completely displaced and expected to come back. And so they're having to rebuild a sense of identity in culture as a group. And what does this look like for us now? And how do we relate to our God now? And so you have these books that have a pretty heavy emphasis on like purity of lineage and not seeing Israelites marrying outside of the Israelite community. It's very significant in Ezra and in Nehemiah. And there's a lot of idea that, because the book was written after the exile, it's thought to push back, like Ruth is thought to push back against some of the policies that we see in these books. And so what I think is kind of fun about that is that even within the Old Testament, you see dialogue unfolding of conflicting ideals, where in one breath, it's saying that no outside community, especially no one from Moab, can be a part of this. And then in Ruth, you have the exact opposite of that narrative that says, well, actually, here's a story about how that worked out really beautifully and was honoring to God and blessed our community, and they're in direct conversation with each other.
Yeah, it just kind of flips that idea on its head.
That's
really cool.
Yeah. So I think that's pretty neat. Mm-hmm. And in general, we get to see two women really like operating counterculturally, and I think that's pretty cool.
Oh my gosh. Do you have any other like final thoughts about Ruth and Naomi and Boaz and maybe, I don't know, what happened on that threshing room floor?
Oh, the threshing room floor. I do have so many thoughts about it. Oh my. Where do we even start? I guess we'll start with the threshing room floor and then we'll move into some other thoughts. That part of the story is really interesting because it is a very gray, it can be interpreted, let me say. It's a very gray experience that they're having together. It is often interpreted as a very romantic experience. It talks about how she like pulls the covers back to reveal his feet. And in a lot of ancient texts, that feet were like symbolic of other spicy activities that people might participate in.
Not safe for work.
So correct. So that is a possibility. And Naomi, like, it's interesting because it's often seen like her pushing of Ruth to go and meet Boaz here is seen as her like reciprocating the support that she's receiving from Ruth back. Because while she's not able to go and glean, she is able to offer some wisdom around how to navigate the society. And so she's like, I want you to be secure. We can continue the family line, possibly. And so she's like, go put your cutest outfit on, do your makeup, go meet him, surrender yourself at his feet, see what happens. Just see. And so she does. She gets there and, kind of has this spicy moment of, do what you're going to do, And then he responds with a lot of integrity, which I think is great. And makes sure no one sees her so that her integrity is upheld, sends her off with a ton of food to make sure she's taken care of, and then immediately goes to figure out the marriage thing. What's interesting, though, I think, is she talks about asking him to spread his cloak over her, which was really a proposal. So to do that was like symbolic of acquiring her. Mm-hmm. And so really what we see in this story is this woman saying, this is how I function in this system. And you're not moving it. I'm going to propose to you and offer you the opportunity.
Yeah. Let's move this along.
To care for me. Yeah. And we see that in this story a lot of these women finding a way to not just be like subject to the society that they're functioning in, but to leverage it for their betterment. And I think it's interesting in this story, the way that Boaz responds to that, because he's actually incredibly flattered by Ruth's directness. And throughout the story, Ruth is described in a lot of ways that might not be seen as always the most desirable. Like she's seen as very direct and very proactive and kind of carrying her family and doing a lot of things that might not have made her appear maybe as like feminine or desirable, whatever that looks like. And yet those are the very things he celebrates about her. And it offers also this other understanding of what it looks like to be a woman in a society like that. And to love and to care for the people in your life. So, what happened on the threshing room floor, everyone can make that up for themselves. But
what happens on the threshing room floor
stays on the threshing room floor. But what I do think is interesting is that you get this story of a woman with all of these characteristics, and you get to see them be elevated, and then you get to see a really incredible payoff at the end of it, which is kind of cool. In general, though, there's a lot of different ways that you can read this story, and there's a lot of lanes with scripture as a whole around like pockets of theology and lenses that people read scripture through. One of my favorites within this is a lens of theology called queering theology.
Say more.
So often when we hear that, like, it does tend to talk about what it looks like to read scripture from the perspective of someone who is a part of the LGBT community, or as though the characters are operating in that kind of a relationship or dynamic. But actually this entire study is not necessarily about like sexual or romantic inclinations. It really is talking about what it looks like for someone to operate in unorthodox ways, to push the boundaries of what it looks like to exist within a group, to kind of be countercultural, and to operate in non-normative spaces and ways and experiences. And I think we see that throughout this story. Like there are some people who look at the dynamic between Ruth and Naomi and are able to connect with the story because it relates to their romantic relationship. And that's great. I think that there's a lot of truth that you can get from these characters in reading it that way. And there's a lot of people who read it and what they see is a really deep platonic relationship that speaks to their friendships. And that's great. Mm-hmm. You can totally read it that way. It looks like what it might mean for someone to see, a shifting in what a like heteronormative relationship dynamic looks like between Ruth and Boaz. That's cool. Mm-hmm. You have Naomi at the end of this story becoming the godmom of Obed, and they have a non-traditional family dynamic. That's great. Like there's a lot of ways that you can read this, and I think that's really fun because you're able to read this story outside of normative context and get so much more out of it and relate to even, I found, like the people in your life better because there's so many different lenses you can read this story through. There's even like a whole part at the end of it where the Obed gets his name literally named from the women in the neighborhood. Like the women named him. And so even at the end, the child receives his name and his love and support from Ruth, Naomi, and the women that surround him. That's different from other things you might see. So I think in general, the fun part about reading this story is that there's so many ways you can take it. And however someone might choose to read this story, I feel like there's something in there for you that might speak to your experience, whatever that experience is, because there's so many layers to it that might resonate.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing about Ruth and Naomi. What a gift to hear more about these ladies. And I cannot wait to hear your sermon, because if this was the stuff that was left out, I can't wait to see what made it in.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Thanks for like making time for the conversation, and thank you all for listening along. I'm really excited for you to not just hear my message and this episode that goes with it, but all the messages in this series, because they're really incredible. And I'm excited to see how this changes how we relate to these duos and how we relate to the people in our lives. So be sure to check out the sermon that goes with this episode on our website, on the Gathering app, and across our social platforms. And with that, we'll catch y'all later.